Here is what the Jin commanders saw from their fortifications on the morning it all fell apart. They saw their army, 500,000 strong, the most powerful military force in East Asia, surge forward in pursuit of a Mongol cavalry unit that appeared to be running for its life. They saw loot scattered across the ground. They saw disorder. They saw an enemy breaking. What they did not see were the tens of thousands of Mongol riders already moving on both flanks. What they did not see were the archers positioned on the high peaks above the pass, and peaks that no military force was supposed to be able to cross. What they did not see was that the retreat in front of them was not a retreat at all. It was an invitation, and they had just accepted it. Within hours, 500,000 men, 500,000 were trapped in a valley with enemies on every side. The arrows came from above, the cavalry came from the flanks. The men in front had stopped running and turned around. There was no direction left to move in that did not lead Edu into a Mongol weapon. The Jin army, the army of the Golden Empire, the most populous and sophisticated state in Asia, ceased to exist as a fighting force before the sun moved to the other side of the sky. 90,000 men had just destroyed 500,000, and the man who planned it had been, 40 years earlier, an abandoned 9-year-old boy with nothing but the steppe and his own refusal to die. Before we go any further, if this kind of history moves you, if you believe these stories deserve to be heard, please take a moment right now to like this video and leave a comment below. Tell us what brought you here. Every comment tells the algorithm that this story matters, and it helps us reach more people who deserve to know it. We are building something here, and we cannot do it without you. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Mongolia does not offer comfort. It never has. The Mongolian plateau sits at an average elevation of 1,500 meters above sea level, ringed by mountain ranges that trap cold air and block moisture. Winter temperatures drop to -40 degrees. Summer heat bakes the grassland to a pale, brittle yellow. Rain is scarce, unpredictable, and never abundant enough. The land supports grazing animals, horses, sheep, goats, cattle, and the people who follow them. It does not support anything else with any consistency. To live on the Mongolian steppe is to be in a permanent negotiation with scarcity. You move because staying in one place exhausts the pasture and kills the herds. You raid because sometimes negotiation fails and your animals die and your children are hungry. You form alliances because alone on this landscape you are already dead. You just haven't fallen yet. And you break alliances when they stop serving survival, because on the steppe, sentimentality is a luxury that the land cannot afford. This is not a background detail. This is the entire context for everything that follows. The people who lived here were not savage by nature. They were rational by necessity. Every behavior that settled civilizations found barbaric. The raiding, the mobility, the apparent lack of permanent attachment to any single place or structure made complete sense within the logic of the environment that produced it. The steppe taught its people that nothing was permanent, that power was relational and conditional, that strength was the only reliable currency, and that the man who could not adapt was the man who did not survive the next winter. Temujin absorbed all of this before he was old enough to articulate it. He absorbed it the way children absorb language, not by studying it, but by living inside it until it became the structure of his thought. To understand the political world Temujin was born into, you need to hold several competing forces in your mind at once. To the south, beyond the Gobi Desert and the line of the Great Wall, sat the Jin Dynasty, the Golden Empire. The Jin were Jurchen people, originally from Manchuria, who had conquered the northern half of the Chinese imperial territories in the early 12th century, displacing the Song dynasty southward. They had absorbed Chinese bureaucratic culture with remarkable efficiency. building a state apparatus that governed 20 million people and fielded armies that dwarfed anything the steppe could produce in raw numbers. The Jin looked north at the nomadic peoples of Mongolia with a mixture of contempt and calculated management, paying some tribes, pressuring others, playing confederacies against each other with the practiced ease of an empire that had been manipulating its frontier for generations. Southwest of Mongolia lay the Western Xia, the Xia or Tangut Kingdom, a buffer state of considerable military strength that controlled the trading routes connecting China to Central Asia. And on the steppe itself, the situation was kaleidoscopic. The Proto-Mongolic Khitan people had once formed a great empire called the Liao, which had fought wars across Korea, China, and Central Asia before being destroyed by the Jin in 1125, and reconstituting itself as the Western Liao, far to the west. In the territory of modern Mongolia, a confederation called the Kamag-Mongol, the whole Mongol, had formed in the early 12th century, grouping several tribes under a loose shared identity. But the Kamag-Mongol was perpetually at war with the Tatar Confederacy to its east, and this grinding generational conflict had consumed the energy and manpower that might otherwise have built something lasting. By the second half of the 12th century, the Kamag-Mongol Confederation had nearly ceased to function. It was in this fragmented, exhausted political landscape that a man named Yesuge, chief of the Borjigin clan, was attempting to rebuild Mongol unity through the oldest tools available: marriage alliances and military pressure. Yesuge was not the paramount Khan of the Mongols. He was a clan chief, influential, respected, ambitious, and he understood that influence on the steppe was measured in relationships as much as in warriors. In 1171, he arranged a betrothal for his son, Temujin, who was 9 years old, to Borte, the daughter of the chief of the Ongirat clan. The Ongirat were known for the beauty of their women and the wisdom of their political marriages, marrying daughters upward, as the saying went, into powerful alliances that secured their clan's safety without requiring them to maintain a large fighting force. Yasugi left Temujin with Borte's family. As was customary, the boy would live with his future in-laws until he came of age for marriage and began the journey home across the steppe. He never made it. The sources disagree on the precise details, as they often do for events this far back and this poorly documented. But the core of what happened is consistent across accounts. Yasuge encountered a group of Tatars on his journey home, was invited to share food and drink with them, and was poisoned. Whether it was deliberate or opportunistic, whether the Tatars knew who he was or simply saw a chance to remove a rival, the result was the same. Yesuge died on the road home. And when the news reached the Borjigin clan, the political calculation shifted immediately. A clan chief's power extended only as far as his ability to protect and provide. A widow and her children were not a power center. They were a liability. The clan left them. Hoilun, Temujin's mother, was a formidable woman. The sources that survive make this clear, even filtered through the mythology that accumulated around her son's story. She fought for her family's survival with a ferocity that matched the landscape. She foraged, she organized, she kept her children alive through winters that should have killed them. Temujin was 9 when his father died. He grew up in poverty that was not the poverty of limited resources in a wealthy society. It was the poverty of the steppe, which meant genuine proximity to starvation, genuine exposure to lethal cold, and genuine vulnerability to the violence of rival clans who had no particular reason to leave a dead chief's family in peace. He was captured at least once and enslaved, forced to wear wooden kangwe, a heavy yoke-like device worn around the neck as a mark of complete subjugation. For a boy who would one day hold the submission of emperors, this detail is not incidental, it is foundational. He wore the mark of a man who belonged to someone else. he escaped. The specifics of how he escaped are disputed and probably embellished in the sources that recorded them decades later. But the fact of his escape and of his survival through those years tells us something important. Whatever Temujin was becoming during the years of poverty and captivity, it was not broken. The steppe had taught him what it taught everyone who survived it, that the only meaningful response to a world that offered nothing was to take what you needed and build from there. He was not yet a warlord. He was not yet a Khan. He was a young man with no clan, no resources, and no protection in one of the most violent political environments on earth. And he was already becoming the most dangerous person in it. By his late teens, Temujin had begun the slow work of rebuilding. He retrieved Borte from the Ongirat clan, honoring the arrangement his father had made, and in doing so, demonstrated something important. He respected agreements. He kept his word in a political environment where trust was the scarcest resource. This was not a small thing, but Borte was captured shortly after by the Merkit tribe, a raid carried out partly as revenge for an earlier Borjigin kidnapping that had involved Temujin's own mother. Temujin responded by forming the first significant military alliance of his adult life. He appealed to Tokrul Khan, leader of the powerful Karai tribe, who had been an ally of his father and who owed Yezugei a debt of support. And he appealed to Jamuka, his Anda, his blood brother, the man with whom he had exchanged the oath that was supposed to transcend all other bonds. The three-way alliance moved against the Merkits. Borte was recovered, and in the immediate aftermath of that campaign, Temujin and Jamuka rode together, raided together, and for a time appeared to be building something that might have reshaped the steppe in a different way entirely, as partners rather than rivals. The blood brotherhood of Anda was not a casual arrangement on the Mongolian steppe. It was a formal oath, witnessed, ceremonially sealed, and treated by those who took it as something approaching sacred. When Temujin and Jamuka called each other Anda, they were declaring that their bond superseded tribal affiliation, that they owed each other the loyalty that blood family commanded, and that the steppes code demanded be honored above almost everything else. For a time, it held. The fracture between Temujin and Jamuka was not caused by a single betrayal or a single moment of crisis. It grew from something deeper, a fundamental disagreement about what power was for and who should hold it. Jamuka believed in the traditional order of the steppe. Tribal aristocracy was, in his view, not just a practical arrangement, but a legitimate one. The sons of chiefs led because their fathers had led, because the blood of leadership ran in recognized lines, because the system of inherited authority was the system the steppe had always used, and the system that provided the stability and predictability that all societies, even nomadic ones, required. Jamuka was not defending his own position alone, though of course his own position was implicated. He was defending a worldview. Temujin was dismantling that worldview piece by piece with every decision he made. When Temujin organized his growing following, he gave positions of command to men who could fight and think, regardless of their birth. A man from a minor clan who demonstrated tactical brilliance rose faster under Temujin than a man from a noble clan who demonstrated nothing but his lineage. Temujin shared war spoils with soldiers and civilians alike, creating loyalty not through hereditary obligation, but through demonstrated benefit. He was building essentially a meritocracy on the steppe. And meritocracy is always a threat to aristocracy because it says explicitly that birth does not determine worth. The men around Jamuka watched their privileges eroding. They watched fighters of low birth gaining authority that tradition said belonged to them. And they went to Jamuka and told him that Temujin needed to be stopped. Jamuka agreed. In 1187, Jamuka assembled 30,000 men and rode against Temujin. Temujin had 20,000. The Battle of Dahlan Balzut was not close. Temujin's forces were decisively defeated, scattered, driven back, stripped of the momentum and reputation that he had been building over years of patient work. Jamuka won the field and reportedly executed Temujin's officers by boiling them alive in cauldrons, a message about what awaited those who supported the wrong vision of power. What happened to Temujin in the decade that followed this defeat is one of the genuine mysteries of his story. The historical sources go largely silent. He does not appear in any record of significant events between 1187 and approximately 1197. 10 years. An entire decade in which the man who would become Genghis Khan is simply absent from the documented world. Historians have speculated. Some believe he continued building alliances quietly below the threshold of events worth recording. Some believe he spent time as a vassal or subordinate to Tokhrul Khan, developing his understanding of larger-scale political organization. Some believe the defeat broke him temporarily, that he retreated, reassessed, and rebuilt himself before emerging. What we know is that the man who reappeared in 1197 was not the same man who was defeated in 1187. He was harder, he was more patient, and he had developed a clarity about what he was building and why that he had not possessed before. Defeat on the steppe was a teacher, and Temujin proved to be an exceptional student. By 1197, Temujin was back commanding a joint Mongol-Karat force in a campaign against the Tatars. The context is important. The Jin Dynasty, which habitually manipulated steppe politics to prevent any single nomadic group from becoming too powerful, had decided it was time to diminish the Tatar Confederacy. They invited Temujin and Tokhrul Khan to participate in this campaign, providing a legitimate framework for a war that Temujin would have fought anyway. The Tatars were the people who had poisoned his father. 20 years had passed. The debt had not expired. The campaign was successful. The Tatar leadership was destroyed. And what Temujin did next revealed the quality of his mind more clearly than the military victory itself. He executed the Tatar aristocrats. Every man whose power was rooted in hereditary claim, every man who would always represent an alternative source of authority. But the ordinary Tatar warriors, the craftsmen, the herders, the families, he offered them a place. Join the growing Mongol structure. Swear loyalty to the new order. And in return, your lives, your futures, your children's futures would be protected under his authority. This was not mercy. It was strategy of a very high order. Every enemy absorbed became a resource. Every rival clan neutralized through integration rather than extermination meant a larger, more capable force moving forward. Temujin was not just winning battles, he was compounding his strength with each victory in a way that pure destruction could never achieve. Between the campaigns, Temujin was doing something that no steppe leader before him had done with any consistency or systematic intent. He was building law. Not law in the sense of written codes handed down by educated jurists in a palace administration. The steppe had no such infrastructure, and Temujin was not yet in any position to create one. But rules, principles, standards of behavior that applied across tribal lines and were enforced by the authority of his growing reputation and military power. Guests were to be treated with hospitality. Envoys were not to be harmed. This was a rule Temujin felt with personal intensity, having grown up in a world where diplomatic communication was one of the few tools available to the weak. The sharing of war spoils was codified rather than left to the discretion of individual commanders. Loyalty was rewarded materially and consistently. Betrayal was punished with a finality that left no ambiguity about the cost. These rules mattered not because they made Temujin's organization morally superior to others. They did not, and the violence that his growing force inflicted was not gentle. They mattered because they made his organization predictable, and predictability on the steppe, where every alliance was contingent and every loyalty was conditional, was worth more than almost any tactical advantage. A warrior who joined Temujin's force knew what he was joining. He knew the rules, he knew the rewards, he knew the consequences of defection. That clarity was itself a form of power, and Temujin understood it and cultivated it deliberately, long before he had an empire to govern. The most consequential military innovation in the history of steppe warfare was not a new weapon or a new tactic. It was an organizational structure. Temujin took the warriors of the Mongolian steppe, men who had always organized themselves along tribal lines, who fought under the banner of their clan and answered to the authority of their clan chief, and restructured them into something that tribal identity could not disrupt. Units of 10, units of 100, units of 1,000, units of 10,000. The decimal system sounds simple. Its implications were radical. Under the old tribal system, a Mongol warrior's primary loyalty was to his clan. If his clan chief told him to fight, he fought. If his clan chief told him to negotiate a separate peace with the enemy or to shift allegiance to a rival leader, the warrior followed his clan chief. This meant that a Mongol army was always, at some level, a coalition of competing loyalties held together by the current political agreement. And political agreements on the steppe were famously fragile. Under Temujin's decimal system, your unit was your clan. You were assigned to a unit of 10, and that unit might contain men from 5 different tribal backgrounds. You trained with these men. You ate with these men. You fought with these men. Your survival in battle depended on these men. Over time, the bond that formed was not tribal. It was something new, something that had not existed on the steppe before, an institutional loyalty that crossed bloodlines. And the enforcement mechanism was severe enough to make desertion nearly unthinkable. If one man abandoned his unit of 10, the other 9 were executed, not the deserter. He was already gone. The 9 who remained. This was not a punishment for failure. It was a structural guarantee of interdependence. Your survival was literally bound to the survival of every man beside you. You were not going to let him run, and he was not going to let you. The 10,000-man Tumen was the fundamental operational unit of Mongol warfare, large enough to be strategically significant, small enough to be commanded with genuine coherence by a single leader who knew his subordinate commanders personally. The commanders of the Tumens were chosen by Genghis Khan himself. This was not delegation. This was personal selection based on demonstrated capability and proven loyalty applied at the level where strategic decisions were made. Below the Tumen level, commanders were chosen by their own men, which created a system where operational leaders were accountable upward to the Khan and downward to the warriors who had selected them. This combination of top-down strategic authority and bottom-up operational trust was unusual in the medieval world, and it created an army that could execute complex maneuvers, multiple separated columns coordinating across large distances, feigned retreats that required every rider to maintain discipline, even while appearing to flee, with a consistency that standing armies with far more sophisticated administrative systems could not match. Every able-bodied man was part of this structure. There was no distinction between the military and civilian male population. The Mongol nation was, in a very real sense, an army with a homeland attached. The 5-year conflict between Temujin and Jamuka that began in 1201 was the last war of the old steppe order. Jamuka had assembled his own coalition, a group of opposing clans who called a kurulte, a council of chiefs, and declared Jamuka their Khan, the legitimate leader of the Mongol world, against the upstart who was dismantling everything the old world held together. It was a genuine contest of visions, not just of men. The clans that supported Jamuka were betting on tradition. The clans that supported Temujin were betting on something new. The war culminated at the Battle of 13 Sides, where Temujin's forces decisively defeated Jamuka's coalition. Jamuka himself was eventually captured betrayed in a final irony by his own subordinates who hoped to buy favor with the rising Khan by delivering his rival to him. Temujin executed the men who betrayed Jamuka. He made clear that betraying your sworn leader, even an enemy, was not a service he would reward. Now, loyalty, even enemy loyalty, was a value he respected, because the entire structure he was building rested on the principle that sworn bonds meant something. Jamuka, according to the sources, asked for a death without bloodshed, a mark of honor on the steppe reserved for those of noble standing. Temujin granted it. His blood brother, his oldest rival, the man who had once beaten him decisively and might have ended his story at Dalen Baljut, died as he had lived, according to the old code, which he had defended to the end. The Great Assembly of 1206 was not a moment of surprise. Everyone who attended knew what was going to happen. The outcome had been written by a decade of military victory and political consolidation. But the ceremony mattered. The formal proclamation mattered. On the steppe, where authority was relational and legitimacy was constructed through shared acknowledgement, the moment of public declaration was not theater. It was the act of creation itself. The chiefs of the Mongolian tribes gathered at the source of the Onon River, and they raised a banner of 9 yak-tails, the symbol of supreme authority, and they proclaimed Temujin, son of Yesuge, Genghis Khan. The title's precise meaning has been debated. Universal ruler, oceanic ruler, leader of all. The scholars disagree on the etymology, but the political meaning was unambiguous. There was now one authority on the Mongolian steppe, not a federation of competing claims, not a coalition that could dissolve when its members' interests diverged. One Khan, one law, one banner. For the first time in the history of these lands, the warring tribes of Mongolia were a nation. Before the Mongols turned to China, they turned to the Tangut Kingdom, the Xixia, which controlled the trade routes connecting the Mongolian plateau to Central Asia, and which had for generations occupied a strategic position that made it both a potential ally and a potential obstacle. The Xixia campaign of 1209 was the Mongol Empire's first major test against a settled, fortified enemy, and it was instructive in ways that went beyond the military outcome. In open battle, the Mongols were devastating. Their cavalry superiority, their coordination, their tactical flexibility, all of it worked exactly as it had been designed to work against other steppe forces, and it worked against Xixia field armies with similar effectiveness. The Tangut forces that met the Mongols in open ground were destroyed. But the cities did not open their gates when the armies outside were defeated. The walls of Xixia cities were built to withstand exactly this kind of nomadic pressure, and the Mongols, who had no significant siege tradition, no catapults, no engineering corps, no established methodology for reducing fortified positions, found themselves in unfamiliar territory. They could surround a city, they could cut its supply lines and wait, but direct assault against prepared walls was costly and often ineffective. The Xixia emperor eventually submitted, accepting vassal status under Genghis Khan and agreeing to pay tribute. It was a diplomatic victory, but Genghis Khan had absorbed something more valuable than tribute from this campaign. He had identified his own limitations, and he had begun the process of addressing them. Engineers and siege specialists who were captured or recruited in subsequent campaigns would become integral to the Mongol military apparatus. The lesson of Xixia, that walls require different tools than cavalry, was a lesson Genghis Khan did not forget. The Jin Dynasty in 1211 was, by almost any measure, an extraordinary state. The Jurchen people who had founded it were themselves conquerors. They had swept down from Manchuria in the early 12th century and shattered the old Liao Empire, then driven the Song dynasty south of the Hui River and seized the northern heartland of Chinese civilization. In the process, they had done something that many conquest dynasties attempted and few achieved with genuine success. They had absorbed and synthesize the culture of the civilization they had conquered. The Jin court at Zhongdu spoke Chinese and Jurchen. Its bureaucracy operated according to Chinese administrative principles refined over centuries. Its scholars produced literature, its artisans produced goods that circulated across trade networks extending from Korea to Central Asia. The city of Zhongdu itself, on the site of modern Beijing, was among the great urban centers of the medieval world, with a population that dwarfed the combined total of every settlement on the Mongolian plateau. The Jin emperor governed perhaps 20 million people. His state collected taxes in silver and grain on a scale that the Mongol economy, built on livestock, raiding, and tribute from smaller neighbors, could not approach. He commanded armies that on paper represented a military force of crushing superiority over anything the steppe could field. And he had been managing the steppe for decades. He knew the nomads. He paid some, pressured others, and when necessary, sponsored one tribe's campaign against another to prevent any single confederation from accumulating the kind of power that could threaten the Jin frontier. This was not negligence. It was a sophisticated system of imperial management that had worked for generations. What it had not accounted for was Genghis Khan. The Jin's confidence in their defensive system was not irrational. It was based on genuine military infrastructure. The Great Wall, not yet the unified stone monument of later Chinese dynasties, but a network of earthen fortifications, watchtowers, and garrison posts ran along the northern frontier. Behind it, a series of heavily fortified cities served as regional military centers, each garrisoned by professional troops capable of concentrating rapidly on any threatened point. The passes through the mountains that separated Mongolia from the Chinese heartland were few, well-known, and heavily defended. Any army coming from the north had to funnel through these passes and funnel through them into prepared positions, defended by forces that could be reinforced from multiple directions. The Jin heavy cavalry, approximately 150,000 professional fighters drawn from military families with generations of training, was a genuine military force of exceptional quality. These were not conscripts. They were soldiers in the fullest sense of the word, equipped, trained, disciplined, and experienced. Against any conventional threat from the north, this system worked. When the Jin mobilized against the Mongol threat in 1211, they assembled a force that in pure numerical terms was staggering. Approximately 800,000 infantry were raised. This number requires immediate qualification. The vast majority of these men were conscripted peasants, pulled from their fields and given weapons with minimal training and even less preparation for what they were about to face. Their morale was fragile in the way that morale is always fragile among men who did not choose to fight and do not understand clearly what they are fighting for. They were not soldiers in any meaningful sense. They were numbers added to the roster to make the total look overwhelming. The professional corps, the 150,000 heavy cavalry, was a different matter entirely. But even these men operated within a command structure that was built for defense and prepared positions, not for the kind of dynamic, multi-directional engagement that the Mongols were capable of forcing. The Jin forces were distributed across the frontier, garrisoning the wall, occupying the passes, holding the fortress cities. And this dispersal was a structural requirement of the defensive system. You could not defend everywhere simultaneously if you concentrated your forces in one location, but it meant that no single point of concentration could bring the full weight of the Jin military to bear. And it meant that the communication between those dispersed units, the ability to coordinate, to reinforce, to respond to unexpected developments, was a genuine vulnerability. Genghis Khan did not need to defeat the entire Jin army. He needed to destroy it in pieces. The Jin emperor's demand that Genghis Khan submit to Jin authority was not unprecedented. Previous Mongol leaders and the leaders of other steppe confederacies had submitted to Jin pressure when the alternative was military confrontation with an empire of overwhelming resources. The Jin had been managing the steppe this way for over a century, and it had worked. What the Jin emperor did not understand was that Genghis Khan had already made the steppe ungovernable in the old way. The tribes that had previously been manageable played against each other, kept fragmented, denied the cohesion that would make them dangerous, were now unified under a single command. The offer of tribute or the threat of Jin military reprisal, which had always been sufficient to manage previous steppe leaders, landed on a man who had spent his entire life refusing to be managed. Genghis Khan's response to the demand for submission was, according to the sources, something close to contempt. He had not conquered every tribe on the Mongolian plateau, had not built the first unified Mongol nation in history, had not defeated the Shisya and extracted their submission, to bow to an emperor who governed from behind walls. The demand did not frighten him, it clarified his purpose. In March of 1211, Genghis Khan called a Kurultai, a council of all Mongol chieftains and senior commanders. The war council was both a military planning session and a political ceremony. Every major commander of the Mongol army was present. The strategic objective was stated clearly: the campaign against the Jin Dynasty. The assembled force was detailed. 90,000 cavalry organized into the decimal structure that had made the Mongol army what it was, divided into operational wings that would move with coordinated independence. The Mongol cavalry force consisted of 3 distinct components that worked in coordinated combination. Light cavalry scouts moved ahead of the main force, gathering intelligence, disrupting enemy communication, and identifying targets. Horse archers, the core of Mongol offensive capability, carried composite bows capable of accurate fire at distance from horseback, a skill that required years of training beginning in early childhood. Heavy cavalry equipped with lances and curved swords delivered the decisive blow once the horse archers had disrupted and disordered the enemy formation. Every man in this army was a professional in the most complete sense of the word. Every man had trained for this from the time he could ride. Every man understood the tactical vocabulary: the encircling maneuver, the feigned retreat, the coordinated attack from multiple directions, not as theoretical principles, but as practiced embodied skills. And every man was bound to the men beside him by the structure that Genghis Khan had built, a structure where a collective survival was not a metaphor, but a lived reality. 90,000 men rode south toward the Gobi Desert and the greatest empire in Asia. The Gobi Desert sits between the Mongolian plateau and the Chinese frontier, like a geological declaration that the two worlds were not meant to interact. It stretches approximately 1,600 kilometers from east to west and 800 kilometers from north to south. Its surface is not, for the most part, the sand dunes of popular imagination. It is gravel and rock, baked hard by summer heat, swept by winds that carry dust across thousands of kilometers, dotted by sparse vegetation that supports almost nothing. Moving 90,000 cavalry and their supply trains across the Gobi was not a logistical exercise that could be improvised. Mongol military planning for a campaign of this scale began months or years in advance. The herds of horses, each Mongol warrior traveled with multiple mounts, rotating between them to maintain speed over long distances, required grazing that the Gobi could not provide in any single corridor. Water sources were mapped, guarded, and rationed. The timing of the crossing was calculated against the seasons, the available forage, and the strategic requirement of arriving at the Jin frontier before the Jin commanders could fully coordinate their response. The Gobi crossing worked because Genghis Khan had built an army capable of sustaining itself under conditions that would have destroyed conventional forces. The Mongol soldier carried minimal equipment and lived on a diet that could be maintained from his own herds: dried meat, fermented mare's milk, blood drawn from his horses in emergencies. He did not require the supply trains of grain and material that made conventional medieval armies so slow and so fragile. He was, in a sense, a self-contained military unit capable of extended independent operation in hostile terrain. The Jin commanders, watching their northern frontier with a system built to detect and respond to conventional threats, were not prepared for an army of 90,000 that materialized south of the Gobi faster than their intelligence network could track. The Great Wall was only as strong as the men assigned to hold it. The Jin garrison system along the northern frontier was extensive but not seamless. The wall itself, earthen construction across much of this stretch, reinforced at strategic points but not uniformly maintained, had gaps, weaknesses, and sections where the terrain made continuous fortification impossible. The garrison troops assigned to these sections were not the elite professional cavalry, but lower-tier units, often local forces with limited training and limited motivation. Genghis Khan had intelligence. The Mongols operated an extensive network of scouts and informants that preceded their military movements, identifying exactly where the wall's gaps were and where the garrisons were weakest. The approach was not a battering ram against the Jin's strongest defenses. It was water finding the path of least resistance, identifying the places where the frontier's logic failed and flowing through them before the defenders could respond. The Great Wall, which the Jin had relied on as a strategic barrier, was bypassed before the main campaign had even formally begun. The psychological impact of this, when the news reached the Jin commanders behind the wall, was significant. A defensive system that cannot stop the enemy from entering is not a defensive system. It is a series of fortifications awaiting a siege. Once through the frontier, Genghis Khan executed the first major operational decision of the campaign. He divided his force. 30,000 cavalry under Ogedei, his third son, a capable commander who would eventually succeed his father as Khan, peeled away to the west toward Datong, a major Jin fortress city that controlled the western approach to the Chinese heartland. Ogedei's mission was not necessarily to take Datong immediately. It was to engage the Jin forces in that sector, prevent them from concentrating against the main effort, and create strategic pressure across a wide front that the Jin could not respond to coherently. The remaining 60,000 under Genghis Khan himself drove south and east. Their objective was the Juyong Pass, the primary gateway through the mountains protecting Zhongdu, the Jin capital. If Genghis Khan could break through Juyong, the road to Zhongdu was open. The two-column approach was not simply a division of labor, it was a strategic forcing mechanism. The Jin command could not concentrate against both threats simultaneously. Every unit committed to stopping Ogedei was a unit unavailable to reinforce the defense of Juyong. Every unit held at Juyong was a unit that could not be sent to support the defense of Datong. The Mongols were creating a decision problem that the Jin's distributed command structure was not equipped to solve efficiently. Genghis Khan's column moved toward Juyong Pass, and somewhere in the mountain country south of the Gobi, the scouts came back with news that stopped the advance. The pass was not lightly held. Between Genghis Khan and Juyong lay a place the Chinese sources called Yehuling, Wild Fox Ridge, where the Jin had concentrated a massive force. The mountains there created exactly the kind of terrain that neutralized the Mongols' greatest advantages. The pass was narrow, the flanking ground was steep and broken, and the sight lines were limited in ways that made the encircling maneuver, the foundational Mongol tactical concept, difficult to execute without warning. The Jin army at Yehuling was enormous. The figures in the sources vary and are certainly inflated in some accounts, but the consensus of historical analysis puts the Jin concentration in this area at numbers vastly exceeding the Mongol force, somewhere in the range of 400,000 to 500,000 men when all elements are combined, though the effective fighting strength was considerably less. The core professional cavalry was substantial. The conscript infantry provided mass and defensive depth, even if it could not be relied upon for aggressive action. On paper, any rational military assessment of the situation at Yehuling in 1211 would have concluded that the Mongols could not break through. They were outnumbered 5-1. They were facing an enemy in prepared positions in terrain that made their cavalry advantages irrelevant. They had no significant siege capability. And beyond the pass, the Jin capital and all the resources of a 20 million person empire awaited. Genghis Khan looked at the situation and made his first decision. He did not attack. The Mongol vanguard made contact with the Jin forward positions at Yehuling, and immediately the scale of the problem became clear to every commander who could see the terrain. The Jin had chosen their ground well. The pass was anchored by mountain walls on both sides. The approaches were covered by Jin archers and infantry in prepared positions. Any direct assault would funnel Mongol cavalry into a killing ground where their mobility was worthless and their numerical disadvantage was decisive. The Jin defenders knew this. They had picked this ground because it negated the attackers' every strength. Genghis Khan pulled back his vanguard and established camp. He sent his scouts, the light cavalry that were his eyes and ears, across every accessible piece of terrain around the Yehuling position. He needed to understand the ground completely, every ridge, every valley, every route that might allow movement where the Jin commanders would not expect movement. He needed to know whether the mountains flanking the pass were truly impassable or merely considered impassable by men who had not thought carefully enough about what the word meant, and he waited. Because the situation was not yet ready to be resolved. And Genghis Khan had learned through decades of hard experience that forcing a resolution before the conditions were right was how generals lost battles they should have won. The Jin commanders at Yehuling were not passive. They were executing a sound strategic plan. Their defensive position controlled the only viable route through the mountains toward Zhongdu. By holding Yehuling with a concentrated force, they were denying Genghis Khan his objective without engaging in the kind of open field battle where Mongol cavalry's superiority would be decisive. Every day the Mongols sat outside the pass was a day the Jin supply network, drawing on the resources of a rich agricultural heartland, could sustain the garrison more easily than the Mongol army, operating at the end of a long supply chain across the Gobi, could sustain itself. The Jin strategy was attrition. Make the Mongols wait, let the logistics of sustaining 90,000 cavalry in hostile country do the work that the Jin army did not need to risk doing itself. A nomadic army that cannot move eventually must retreat, and a retreat across the Gobi under pressure from Jin pursuit forces would not look like an orderly withdrawal. It was a rational strategy. It was a good strategy. It was based on a correct assessment of the Mongol army's logistical vulnerabilities and the Jin army's positional advantages. What it did not account for was Genghis Khan's ability to change the problem. Maintaining 90,000 cavalry in the field during an extended standoff was genuinely difficult, and Genghis Khan would not have been unaware of the pressures his army was under. Horses require substantial grazing. The mountain terrain around Yehuling was not rich pasture. The supply lines back through the passes and across the Gobi to the Mongolian plateau were long and vulnerable. The longer the standoff continued, the more pronounced these pressures became. Genghis Khan managed this with the same meticulous attention to logistics that had characterized every successful phase of his campaigns. He rotated grazing areas. He sent raiding parties into the surrounding countryside, both to gather supplies and to keep his men active and purposeful rather than idle. idle cavalry armies developed morale problems quickly. The Mongol soldiers were trained fighters, not garrison troops, and the discipline of the decimal system could manage behavior but could not manufacture patience indefinitely. What Genghis Khan communicated to his commanders during this period, through action rather than declaration, was that the standoff at Yehuling was not a problem waiting for a frontal solution. It was a lock waiting for the right key, and he had sent the men to find the key. The detachment of Jebei and Subutai was the operational pivot of the entire campaign. Genghis Khan separated a smaller force from the main body at Yehuling and sent it west under the command of his two most gifted operational generals. Their objective was the fortress of Wuxia, a Jin installation on the western approaches that sat behind the main Yehuling position. The route Jebei and Subutai were given required traversing mountain terrain that the Jin command had assessed as militarily impassable, too steep, too broken, too difficult to move a significant force through in any tactically relevant time frame. The Jin assessment was reasonable. The terrain was genuinely difficult, but difficult and impossible are different things, and the Mongol army had been operating in difficult terrain across the entire length of its existence. The light cavalry that formed the advance element of Jebei and Subutai's force could move through mountain country that would stop heavier formations cold. The supply requirements of a smaller, lighter force were manageable across terrain where a full army could not sustain itself. The flanking column moved, slowly, but it moved, and the Jin commanders at Yehuling, focused on the main Mongol force sitting patiently outside their position, received no intelligence that anything was happening behind them. These were not ordinary men. Jebei, whose name means arrow in Mongolian, had come to Genghis Khan's service in an unusual way. He had been a commander in an enemy force that had fought against the Mongols, and during the battle he had shot an arrow that struck Genghis Khan's horse. After the enemy was defeated, Genghis Khan sought out the man who had made the shot. Jebei admitted it openly, offering his life if the Khan demanded it. Genghis Khan instead offered him a command, the directness, the courage of the admission, the quality of the shot itself. All of it was exactly the kind of thing the great Khan valued. Jebei would go on to conduct some of the most extraordinary military operations of the 13th century. His campaigns ranged from China to Persia to the edges of Europe. His tactical instincts were as sharp as any commander of his era, and his mastery of the Mongol operational toolkit, speed, deception, coordinated maneuver across extended distances, was matched by very few. Subutai was different in temperament but equal in capability. He was a planner, meticulous, patient, obsessed with intelligence and preparation. He gathered information the way other commanders gathered weapons, and he used it with similar precision. Together, Jebei and Subutai represented the best the Mongol military produced, one the master of the decisive moment, the other the architect of the conditions that made decisive moments possible. Genghis Khan sent his two best generals because this mission could not fail. The assault on the Wuxia fortress was swift and brutal. The garrison at Wuxia had not been reinforced or placed on high alert because the Jin command did not believe a significant Mongol force could approach from that direction. The defensive logic of the entire Yehuling position rested on the assumption that the mountains to the west were a natural barrier requiring no military garrison beyond a minimal caretaker force. When Jebei and Subutai's column appeared, it appeared somewhere the defenders had been told to expect nothing. The fortress fell. The details of the assault are sparse in the surviving sources. We know the outcome more clearly than the sequence of events that produced it. What we know with certainty is that the Jin commander and his garrison were annihilated. The fortress that was supposed to anchor the western flank of the Yehuling defensive system was instead a Mongol position. The strategic map had changed completely. The Jin army at Yehuling area, which had been sitting in a defensive position of enormous strength, was now facing Mongol forces on two sides. The mountains that had been their shield were now, with the fall of Wuxia, a structure that could trap them. The passes they controlled prevented Mongol cavalry from coming through the front door, but the back door was no longer under their control. Jebei and Subutai turned their force east and moved to rejoin the main army. When their riders appeared in the Mongol camp, Genghis Khan knew the lock had been opened. The moment the flanking force reunited with the main Mongol army at Yehuling was the moment the battle's outcome was decided, even though the battle had not yet begun. Every piece that Genghis Khan needed was now in place. The main force, 60,000 strong, held the Jin army's attention at the mouth of the pass. The flanking force, having destroyed the Wuxia fortress, was positioned to threaten the Jin rear and exploit any movement. The high ground on the peaks overlooking the pass, terrain the Jin had judged unusable, had been scouted, and teams positioned there in the weeks of patient waiting. The Mongol commanders knew their roles. The signals were established. The timing was understood. What Genghis Khan had built over the weeks of apparent inaction was not a plan in the sense of a rigid sequence of predetermined steps. It was a set of conditions designed to make whatever happened next into a Mongol victory. The exact form of the Jin army's decision mattered less than the fact that whatever decision they made, the Mongols were prepared to exploit it. This is the distinction between a general who reacts to circumstances and a general who creates them. Jebei led the initial movement, a forward element of Mongol cavalry, carefully selected, thoroughly briefed, composed of men who could maintain the fiction of panic without breaking it, moved toward the Jin forward positions. They engaged. Arrows were exchanged. The Mongols pressed forward, and then, in what appeared to the Jin commanders watching from their positions as the breaking point of an ill-judged assault, they turned. They ran. They dropped supplies as they fled. Equipment was scattered on the ground behind them, things a retreating force would leave when it had decided survival mattered more than material. Horses moved in the disordered, bunching way that cavalry moves when command has broken down and every man is making his own calculation about how to escape. It looked from the Jin fortifications exactly like what it was designed to look like. An enemy that had attempted a probe found the defense too strong and broken. The feigned retreat was not a new tactic. Steppe cavalry forces had used it for centuries before Genghis Khan was born. The Jin commanders would have known in the abstract that it was a Mongol technique. They would have been briefed on it. They would have told their subordinates to watch for it. But knowing a tactic exists and recognizing it in the moment of apparent victory are two different things. When you see your enemy running, when you see loot on the ground, when the momentum of battle seems to be delivering the decisive result you have been waiting months for. The pull toward pursuit is not a rational calculation. It is visceral. It is the warrior's instinct, the commander's opportunity, the soldier's chance to turn a tactical success into a strategic annihilation. The Jin commanders gave the order to pursue. The decision to leave the fortifications was made at multiple levels of the Jin command structure, which tells us something important about how complete the deception was. A single commander taking the bait against the advice of his subordinates is one thing. That is one man's error, one man's misjudgment. What happened at Yehuling was different. The pursuit decision cascaded through the Jin command structure because the evidence in front of every commander's eyes told the same story. The Mongols were fleeing. The pass that had been the objective was now unconstrained. The enemy was disordered and would be cut apart by Jin heavy cavalry if they could close the distance before the Mongols reached open ground. The Jin forces surged out of the pass. Heavy cavalry in the van, infantry pressing behind, the mass of the formation compressing forward in the way that large forces compress when the front elements accelerate, and the rear elements have no information about what is happening, except that everyone in front of them is moving. This compression was lethal. A force in pursuit that is moving into a narrow valley is a force that has abandoned its ability to respond to threats from directions other than the one it is pursuing. The momentum of the pursuit becomes its own trap. You cannot stop quickly. You cannot turn quickly. You cannot spread laterally to respond to flanking threats because the terrain and the press of your own men prevent it. The Jin army was inside the jaws before it understood that jaws had closed around it. The Mongol response was not a single dramatic moment. It was a sequence of overlapping actions, coordinated across multiple forces and multiple positions that collectively transformed the Jin pursuit from an opportunity into a catastrophe. On both flanks, the wings of Mongol cavalry that had been positioned outside the Jin line of sight during the weeks of waiting began to move. They were not moving at a gallop. Not yet. They were moving at the precise pace that would bring them into the flanks of the pursuing Jin force at the moment when the feigned retreat had drawn the pursuit far enough forward that a retreat was impossible. Timing of this kind across separated forces with no radio communication and no real-time coordination was achieved through pre-planned signals and through the kind of tactical discipline that only the Mongol decimal system had been able to create on the steppe. From the high peaks above the pass, the peaks that the Jin military assessment had declared impassable, the peaks where Mongol units had been quietly positioned during the long weeks of waiting, arrow fire began to descend. Let that settle for a moment. The Jin army was in the valley, surging forward in pursuit of what they believed was a broken enemy, and arrows were coming from above them, from ground that no one was supposed to be on. The psychological impact of this, the sudden realization that the position they had trusted, the terrain they had considered their ally, was now being used against them, was as damaging as the arrows themselves. And then Jebe's cavalry, the unit that had been running, turned around. They turned around because the signal had been given, because the pursuit had extended far enough, because the trap had been set and the prey was fully inside it. They turned and they came back, and the Jin forces that had been chasing them were now facing cavalry in front, cavalry on both flanks, and arrow fire from above. There was no direction that did not contain a Mongol weapon. What followed was not a battle in any meaningful tactical sense. It was a killing. The Jin heavy cavalry, the professional core of the force, attempted to fight back. Professional soldiers do not simply collapse when they find themselves in a bad position. They fight because they are trained to fight, because the alternative is death, and because in the chaos of a developing engagement, it is not always immediately clear that the situation is as catastrophic as it actually is. There was fighting at the center of the Jin mass, where the professional units tried to create space, tried to break through one of the encircling wings, tried to find a direction that offered even the possibility of escape. They could not. The encirclement was complete. The Mongol wings had closed behind them. The arrow fire from the peaks above was continuous and devastating. The conscript infantry, which had never been reliable and which was now experiencing exactly the kind of terror that untrained men experience when they find themselves surrounded with no clear leadership and no clear direction, was disintegrating. Commanders were cut off from their units. Units were cut off from each other. The cohesion that makes an army, the shared understanding of who is in command, what the plan is, what direction to move, dissolved in the compression of the valley and the rain of arrows and the closing pressure of Mongol cavalry. The Jin army at Yehuling ceased to exist as a fighting force. The survivors, and there were survivors, though their numbers represented a fraction of the force that had entered the valley, scattered. Some fled back toward the passes and the fortifications they had abandoned. Some fled south, away from the Mongols, away from the battle, abandoning their equipment as they ran. Some were hunted down by the light cavalry that the Mongols used for exactly this purpose, pursued after the main engagement, maximizing the damage and ensuring that the shattered force could not reconstitute itself. The battlefield itself, when the last of the fighting was over, was a scene of destruction on a scale that the region had not witnessed in living memory. The sources speak of corpses covering the valley floor for kilometers of equipment and horses, and the detritus of a force that had been hundreds of thousands strong abandoned across the landscape. What Yehuling changed was not just the military situation in northern China, it changed the question. Before Yehuling, the question was whether the Mongols could break through the Jin's frontier defenses and reach the Chinese heartland. The answer, based on the available evidence, was genuinely uncertain. The Jin had assets: the fortified passes, the concentrated forces, the logistical advantages of fighting on their own territory. That might have been sufficient to blunt the Mongol campaign and force a negotiated withdrawal. It had happened before with previous steppe threats. It might have happened again. After Yehuling, the main Jin field army north of Zhongdu had been destroyed. The professional cavalry that formed the mobile core of the Jin defensive capability in the north, the force that could have contested the Mongols in the open country between the passes and the capital, was shattered. The garrison forces in the surviving fortresses and cities were now isolated positions without a field army to support them. They could hold their walls, but they could not project power, could not move, could not reinforce each other, could not contest the Mongol control of the countryside between the fortress walls. The gates of China, as the sources would later describe it, were open. Genghis Khan looked south at the road to Zhongdu and then made the decision that revealed, perhaps better than anything else in his career, the quality of his strategic judgment. He did not immediately march on the capital. He raided. He let his army move through the countryside, gathering supplies, destroying Jin logistical infrastructure, demonstrating to the population of northern China that the Jin emperor could not protect them, and buying the time needed to develop the siege capability that taking a city like Zhongdu would require. He was not finished. He was just beginning. The weeks and months following Yehuling saw the Mongol cavalry spread across northern China with a systematic thoroughness that the Jin garrison commanders, locked inside their fortress walls, could do nothing to stop. Mongol light cavalry moved faster than any Jin response could organize. By the time a garrison received word that a Mongol raiding column was in a particular district, that column had already moved on. Towns that had no significant military presence were stripped of supplies and left burning. Roads were cut, bridges were destroyed, the administrative infrastructure that connected the Jin frontier to its heartland, the grain depots, the relay stations, the tax collection points, was systematically dismantled. This was not random violence, it was deliberate strategic degradation. Every supply depot burned was food the Jin army could not eat. Every communication road severed was a delay added to the Jin command's ability to coordinate a response. Every local official killed or fled was a node removed from the administrative network that made the Jin state function. Genghis Khan was not just raiding China, he was disassembling it piece by piece in exactly the areas where the Jin needed it to function to mount a coherent defense. The Jin garrisons watched from their walls and counted their supplies and sent messengers to Zhongdu, asking for relief that could not come. When a city chose to open its gates, the terms were specific and they did not vary. Most of the population would be killed or enslaved. This was not negotiable, and the sources are consistent enough across multiple traditions that it cannot be attributed to enemy propaganda. It was deliberate policy, and it served a purpose that Genghis Khan had thought through. A city that submitted under threat but retained its population and infrastructure was a city that could potentially reconstitute its resistance when the Mongol force moved on. Reducing the population was the brutal mechanism by which the Mongols ensured that submission was permanent rather than tactical. But within this horror, there were specific categories of people who were not killed. Engineers who could build or destroy fortifications, physicians who could treat the sick and wounded, artisans who could produce weapons, saddles, tools, merchants who understood trade routes and commercial networks, administrators who could manage the logistics of an expanding empire, teachers and scholars who carried knowledge, religious figures whose influence over local populations could serve the Mongol administrative interest. These people were spared and incorporated. They were invited, a word that in this context requires no quotation marks to convey its compelled nature, to join the Mongol apparatus and carry their skills forward into the next campaign, the next conquest, the next administrative challenge that a growing empire would inevitably produce. This is how the Mongol Empire grew more capable with each conquest. Every city taken added expertise to the apparatus. Every engineer built the next siege machine. Every administrator pressed into service, helped govern the next acquired territory. The Mongols were building a civilization out of the civilizations they destroyed, incorporating what they needed and discarding what they did not. There is a dimension of Mongol warfare that the historical record documents with sufficient consistency that it cannot be minimized or explained away. And it deserves to be addressed directly because any account of this period that romanticizes the Mongol military achievement without confronting its human cost is doing a disservice to the people who lived and died inside it. Prisoners, civilians captured in the preceding conquests were used as human shields in subsequent sieges. They were driven in front of Mongol attack columns placed in the vanguard of assaults on fortified walls, positioned where the arrows from the defenders above would have to pass through them to reach the Mongol soldiers behind. The purpose was functional: to block arrows, to absorb the initial defensive fire, and to create a psychological problem for the defenders who might recognize among the approaching crowd the faces of their neighbors, their relatives, people they knew. The defenders faced an impossible choice: fire into the crowd of their own people to slow the Mongol advance, or hold their fire and allow the Mongols to approach the walls with reduced casualties. There was no good answer. The Mongols had designed a situation in which every option available to the defender caused suffering that the defender had not chosen and could not prevent. This is what Mongol warfare looked like from inside the walls. Not the clean tactical elegance of the feigned retreat and the encircling cavalry, but the grinding, intimate brutality of a system designed to impose suffering as a strategic tool. The men and women of the cities of northern China in 1211 and the years that followed did not experience a military campaign. They experienced the end of everything they had known. History that forgets this is not history. It is military theory decorated with names. By 1213, the Mongols were ready to move against Zhongdu itself. The Jin capital was among the most heavily fortified cities in the medieval world. Its walls were thick, high, and built by engineers who had spent their careers preparing this city to withstand exactly this kind of external threat. The garrison inside was substantial, composed of professional soldiers who had not been at Yehuling and whose fighting capacity was intact. The city's internal supplies, accumulated over years of preparation for the possibility of siege, could sustain a large population for an extended period. A direct assault was not feasible. The Mongols had learned this at Shisha, and they had refined their understanding of why in the years of campaigning since. You did not take a city like Zhongdu by rushing its walls. You took it by making the walls irrelevant, by surrounding them so completely that nothing moved in or out, by cutting every supply line and communication route, and by waiting for the city's internal resources to do the work that your army could not. The Mongols encircled Zhongdu. The siege was long and ugly in the way that all sieges of great cities are long and ugly. Months passed. Inside the walls, the Jin emperor and his court weighed their options against growing understanding that relief was not coming from outside and that the supplies inside were finite. Outside the walls, the Mongol camp developed its own problems. An epidemic spread through the besieging force, killing soldiers and horses and forcing Genghis Khan to adjust his operational posture. Neither side was comfortable. Both sides were calculating. Eventually, the Jin emperor Xuanzong chose negotiation over annihilation. The tribute he agreed to pay was enormous: gold and silver in large quantities, silk by the thousands of bolts, horses by the hundreds, enslaved people, and his own daughter given as a concubine to Genghis Khan. In exchange, the Mongols would withdraw. The Mongols withdrew. The Mongol army had barely cleared the Great Wall when a rider came. The Jin emperor had moved his court south to Kaifeng. The messenger who delivered this news to Genghis Khan outside the wall, it was carrying, without knowing it, a death sentence. Not for himself, but for Zhongdu, for Xuanzong's dynasty, and for the millions of people whose fate was tied to the Jin Empire's survival. On the steppe, the meaning of this action was unambiguous. A ruler who accepted vassal status and then moved his administrative center away from the direction of his supposed overlord was a ruler who intended to repudiate that submission at the first available opportunity. He was buying time. He was preserving his political core in a location the Mongols had not yet reached, waiting for a moment when the empire could stabilize and reassert itself. Genghis Khan had expected peace. He had accepted tribute and walked away from a city he could not quickly take. And the man he had walked away from was already preparing to betray the arrangement. The rage this produced was not merely personal. It was political and strategic. If the Jin emperor could accept submission and then simply move his court south and resume resistance, then the entire structure of tributary relationship and negotiated peace that Genghis Khan used to manage the territories beyond his direct military reach was meaningless. Other vassal rulers would watch what happened next. The lesson needed to be unambiguous. Genghis Khan turned back toward Zhongdu. The second approach to Zhongdu was different from the first in one decisive respect. Genghis Khan brought engineers, not just Mongol commanders and cavalry, those he had in abundance. He brought the accumulated technical expertise of years of conquest in the form of Chinese military engineers who had been captured or recruited in the campaigns since 1211. These men understood how the walls of Chinese cities were built because they had built walls like them. They knew the stress points, the vulnerabilities, the places where a concentrated force applied in the right way could breach fortifications that appeared impregnable to men without that knowledge. The Mongol Empire was, in a very real sense, a military organization that got better with every enemy it defeated because it incorporated the defeated enemy's expertise into its own apparatus. The Chinese engineers who helped bring down Zhongdu were building on the knowledge of previous Chinese engineers who had built the walls of previous Chinese cities that previous Mongols had taken. Each conquest funded the knowledge required for the next. The return to Zhongdu brought another element that had not been present in the first siege, complete commitment. There would be no negotiated withdrawal this time. Genghis Khan had accepted a settlement and been betrayed, or believed he had been betrayed, which produced the same result. The political logic of the steppe required that this betrayal produce consequences visible and severe enough to communicate permanently what happened when agreements made with the Great Khan were dishonored. The encirclement of Zhongdu in the second siege was total in a way that the first had not been. Every road into the city was cut. Every supply route was monitored and interdicted. The engineers deployed their machinery, catapults, battering equipment, devices for undermining walls against the sections of the fortifications that the technical assessment had identified as most vulnerable. The process was systematic rather than dramatic, an engineering problem being solved by engineers under military protection, while the cavalry maintained the blockade and prevented any attempt at breakout or resupply. Inside the city, the situation deteriorated in the sequential, merciless way that siege situations always deteriorate. First, the comfortable supplies were exhausted, then the marginal supplies, then the things that had not seemed like food became food. Disease moved through the crowded population in the way that disease always moves, through populations compressed by siege conditions without regard for rank or innocence. The garrison maintained its position. Professional soldiers do not surrender easily, and there were commanders inside Zhongdu who understood that surrender would not produce the gentle treatment that the Jin emperor had purchased in the first negotiation. No second negotiation was offered. The walls of Zhongdu came down. The engineers had identified the section, calculated the approach, built the machines, and directed the sustained application of force that eventually created the gap. When the breach appeared in the walls of the Jin capital, when the defensive structure that had defined the boundary between the Jin world and the Mongol threat simply ceased to be structurally sound, the garrison's options collapsed with it. The Mongols entered the city. What followed inside the walls of Zhongdu belongs to a category of historical events that resist clean narration. Not because the sources are unclear, they are actually unusually consistent on the broad outlines, but because the scale of what happened strains the narrative tools that historians use to make the past comprehensible. We are not talking about a battle with casualties. We are talking about the systematic destruction of one of the great cities of the medieval world. The Jin garrison fought. Sections of the city changed hands and changed back. Buildings burned. Streets that had served commerce and daily life for generations became the terrain of house-to-house combat between desperate defenders and a force that had been outside those walls for months and had not come back a second time to negotiate. The fires in Zhongdu burned for a month, and this detail, repeated in multiple independent sources from different traditions, gives the scale of the destruction a specificity that numbers alone cannot provide. A fire that burns for 30 days is not an accident or a side effect of battle. It is a structural feature of total destruction. It means that the materials available to burn, buildings, warehouses, granaries, libraries, palace complexes, market districts, the accumulated physical infrastructure of a major city, were dense enough and sufficient enough to sustain combustion across an entire city for an entire month. The carts began to move north almost immediately, thousands of them, loaded with the gold and silver and silk and jade and books and weapons and everything else that the Jin capital had accumulated over its generations as the center of a wealthy empire moving north through the mountain passes toward Mongolia. For weeks, the caravan of extraction continued, the systematic removal of Zhongdu's wealth to the steppe from which the force that had taken it had come. Travelers who passed through the ruins of Zhongdu in the months that followed left accounts in the sources that historians have returned to repeatedly because of their specificity. They describe the quality of the soil as changed, enriched, they say, by the scale of human death, in a way that made the ruins of the city grotesquely fertile in the years that followed. They describe the silence of streets that had once contained hundreds of thousands of people. They describe structures that had been palaces and temples reduced to foundations and fragments. A city that had taken generations to build had been erased in a matter of weeks. The testimony of those travelers is, in some ways, the most honest account of what Mongol conquest meant at the human level. Not the tactical elegance of Yehuling, not the strategic genius of the flanking maneuver, not the operational brilliance of Jebei and Subutai, but the soil changed by the scale of death. The silence, the smell. The Jin Dynasty that had seemed so formidable, that had dismissed the Mongols as a northern nuisance, that had demanded their submission, that had built walls and trained cavalry and organized garrison networks and mobilized armies of hundreds of thousands, was not gone yet. The court at Kaifeng survived. The dynasty would limp forward for decades before its final collapse, but the Jin Empire that existed after the fall of Zhongdu was a diminished, contracted thing, fighting a rearguard action against a force that had demonstrated conclusively that no wall was high enough and no army was large enough to stop what Genghis Khan was willing to do. What had once governed 20 million people had been brought to its knees by 90,000 riders from the steppe. The riders turned around. They went home to Mongolia with their treasure and their prisoners and their engineers and their accumulated knowledge of how to take the next city and the one after that. And Genghis Khan, riding north through the passes of the Great Wall with the smoke of Zhongdu somewhere behind him, turned his gaze west. The Battle of Yehuling did not enter the canon of great battles immediately. It was not commemorated with monuments or celebrated in the poetry of the victors in the way that later Mongol triumphs would be. It was in the context of the larger campaign against the Jin, a single engagement in a war that would continue for decades. But what it demonstrated, the specific combination of strategic patience, deceptive operational maneuver, terrain exploitation, and the weaponization of the enemy's own momentum against itself, represented a model of military problem solving that has influenced military thinking ever since. The feigned retreat that Jebei executed at Yehuling was not simply a tactical trick. It was the final component of a strategic architecture that had been constructed over weeks. The flanking column that neutralized the Jin rear, the archers positioned on the supposedly impassable high ground, the encircling wings positioned outside the Jin line of sight, the careful management of the standoff period to prevent the Jin from detecting the preparations. Each element was necessary. Remove any one of them, and the feigned retreat becomes a real retreat pursued by a force that cannot be stopped. Military historians studying the Yehuling campaign have identified in it principles that reappear in different technological contexts across the subsequent centuries. The importance of combined arms coordination between separated forces, the strategic value of forcing a multi-front problem on a defender organized for single-front response, the psychological dimension of battlefield deception, and perhaps most fundamentally, the danger of allowing numerical superiority to create complacency about positional vulnerability. 500,000 men lost to 90,000 because the 500,000 stopped thinking about what they could not see. Military legacy has a way of sanitizing the past into maneuver and outcome, into clean arrows on maps and efficient summaries of engagement results. The numbers in the accounts of Yehuling and the subsequent campaign against the Jin are so large that they risk becoming abstractions, figures that register as significant without registering as human. The people who died in the valley at Yehuling were soldiers, yes, but they were also men who had come from somewhere. They had been conscripted from villages across northern China, handed weapons by officials they could not refuse, marched to a mountain pass they had never seen, and placed in a formation so large that most of them could not have seen the men fighting at either end of the line. The professional cavalry among them had chosen military careers and understood the risks. The conscript infantry had chosen nothing. They had been chosen in the way that ordinary people in imperial systems are always chosen, by proximity, by misfortune, by the bad luck of living near a road that military conscription traveled. The cities that burned after Yehuling contained millions of people who had had no role in the Jin emperor's decision to demand Mongol submission, who had not designed the defensive strategy, who had not been at the Kurultai where the war was declared. They lived inside the walls of the empire that Genghis Khan had decided to destroy, and that proximity was all the fate they needed. This is not an argument against understanding or studying the Mongol campaigns. It is an argument for understanding them completely, not just as a story about a military genius and his extraordinary army, but as a story about what that genius cost the people who stood between it and its objectives. The man who rode away from Zhongdu with the smoke of a month-long fire, somewhere behind him was 70 years removed from the 9-year-old boy who had been left on the steppe with nothing. What that transformation cost, not just the external cost measured in other people's lives in cities and dynasties, but the internal cost measured in what a human being becomes through a life entirely oriented toward power and survival, is not something the sources address with any directness. Genghis Khan did not leave memoirs. The secret history of the Mongols, the closest thing to an internal Mongol account of this period, was composed after his death and reflects the mythology that accumulated around him as much as the man himself. What we can say is that the decisions he made throughout his life were consistent. He was not a man who confused mercy with weakness or sentiment with wisdom. He was a man who had survived conditions that should have killed him by refusing to make mistakes that could not be recovered from. The policies he implemented, the harsh enforcement of loyalty, the absorption of useful expertise, the deliberate destruction of traditional authority structures, were not expressions of cruelty for its own sake. They were rational responses to the specific problem of building and maintaining power in a world that did not reward generosity toward enemies. Whether the cost was worth it is a question that history does not answer. It poses the question, lays out the evidence, and leaves the judgment to whoever is willing to look at it honestly. After Zhongdu, Genghis Khan turned west. The world that lay in that direction had no idea what was coming. The Khwarezmian Empire, centered in modern Iran, Uzbekistan, and Afghanistan, was the dominant power of Central Asia, vast and wealthy and led by a Shah who had recently destroyed the Karakitan Khanate and fancied himself the heir to the Abbasid Caliphate's military glory. The Russian principalities of the north were fractious and divided, each city-state calculating its own interests against its neighbors. The kingdoms of Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, were organized around feudal military traditions that had no relevant experience with what was about to arrive on their eastern frontier. The Mongol Empire that rode west after the Jin campaign was not the force that had crossed the Gobi in 1211. It was larger. It was richer. It had incorporated Chinese engineers and Jin administrators and Shisha craftsmen and every other category of expertise that the campaigns of the previous decade had made available. It had learned from the hardest possible school exactly how to identify the vulnerabilities of settled civilizations and exploit them with a speed and coordination that those civilizations could not match. And it had Jibei and Subutai, who would conduct a reconnaissance campaign through the Caucasus and into southern Russia, and then into Ukraine that covered more territory than any military expedition in history to that point, returning with intelligence about the political landscape of Eastern Europe that the Mongol High Command would use to plan the invasions that would come years later. The campaign against the Jin was not an ending. It was a beginning. The world that Yehuling opened was not just China, it was the road to everything beyond China, and Genghis Khan intended to travel all of it. We began this story in a valley surrounded by arrows. We began with the moment when the math stopped mattering, when 500,000 men found themselves trapped by 90,000, when the mountains that had been a shield became a cage, when the momentum of pursuit that had seemed like opportunity became the mechanism of destruction. What made that moment possible was not magic. It was not destiny. It was not the intervention of any force beyond the human. It was 40 years of accumulated experiences of defeat and recovery, of poverty and survival, of patient observation, of learning from every mistake and every enemy and every piece of terrain and every political failure. It was a military system of extraordinary sophistication built from principles that had never been applied at this scale before. It was the willingness to wait when waiting was right, and to move with absolute commitment when the moment arrived. It was, in the end, the product of a world that had refused to let an abandoned boy die quietly on the steppe. Genghis Khan did not change history because he was invincible. He changed it because he understood more completely than almost anyone of his era that the space between what is considered impossible and what is actually impossible is where battles are won and empires are built. Yehuling is that space compressed into a single afternoon. If this story moved you, if you found yourself thinking differently about what one human life, shaped by the hardest possible circumstances, can set in motion, please leave a comment below. Tell us what part of this story struck you most. Tell us what you think about the choices Genghis Khan made, about the cost of his ambitions, about what history asks us to hold in our minds when we look at this kind of power. We read every comment. Every one of them helps this channel reach more people who care about history told this way, with honesty, with depth, and with the full weight of what it actually cost the people who lived it. If you haven't already, please subscribe, hit the like button, share this video with someone who loves history or someone who thinks they don't, because the best history changes that. This was the Battle of Yehuling. This was Genghis Khan's greatest victory. The story doesn't end here. It never did.